The polished mahogany of the dining table reflected the cruel smirk on Marcus Thorne's face, distorting it into a grotesque mask of triumph. Across from him, Ethan sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the unassuming black leather portfolio in his lap. The air in the cavernous dining room was thick with the scent of roasted duck and condescension. Marcus, his father-in-law, a man built from old money and brittle arrogance, leaned forward, his voice a low, dismissive drawl that cut through the clinking of silverware. "Let's be honest, Ethan. This experiment of yours in architecture is over. You had a good run, played with the big boys, and you lost. It happens. There's no shame in admitting you're out of your depth." He gestured around the room, at the silk wallpaper and the ancestral portraits glowering from their gilded frames. "This is the real world, a world of stability, of legacy, not flights of fancy built on concrete and glass." Ethan's wife Clara sat between them, a ghost at her own father's feast. She wouldn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on her plate, her knuckles white where she gripped her fork. Her silence was the loudest sound in the room, a screaming void where her support should have been. For a month, this had been his reality. A month of feigned failure. A month of watching the woman he loved crumble not from empathy for him, but from the shame he was supposedly bringing upon her family. They thought he was ruined. They believed the carefully constructed narrative he had spun about a catastrophic project failure, a client lawsuit that had wiped him out. They saw him as a cautionary tale, a temporarily amusing diversion who had finally been put back in his place. They didn't know. They couldn't possibly comprehend that the portfolio on his lap didn't contain resumes or desperate pleas for a loan. It contained the fully executed, multi-million-dollar sale agreement for his architectural firm, a document that represented the culmination of a decade of relentless work and a future so bright it would scorch their petty, envious eyes. Within the next hour, their world, built on the fragile foundation of perceived superiority, would be reduced to rubble. And he would be the one to light the fuse. Hey everyone, thanks for joining me for this story. It's a tough one to tell, but I think it's important. We've all been in situations where we felt underestimated or misjudged, right? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now stick with me, because what happens next is something you won't want to miss. The test, as he had come to call it, began on a Tuesday. It was born not of malice, but of a creeping, insidious doubt that had taken root in his heart over the years. He loved Clara, but he was increasingly aware that she was two people: the warm, funny, brilliant woman he had married, and the anxious, approval-seeking daughter of Marcus and Eleanor Thorne. He had just finalized the sale of Kalis Designs, the firm he'd built from a drafting table in his spare bedroom into an award-winning international powerhouse. The numbers were staggering, life-altering. It was a moment for champagne, for celebration, for dreams. But as he sat in his car, the signed papers a heavy, thrilling weight in his briefcase, he pictured telling Clara. He saw the flash of joy in her eyes, but then he saw it being swiftly replaced by a different light, the triumphant gleam of vindication she would feel in front of her family. His success would become her social armor. And so he made a decision, a painful, risky decision. He would tell her the opposite. He would test the foundation of their marriage, of her love. Was it built on the solid bedrock of partnership or on the shifting sands of her family's approval? He walked into their beautiful, minimalist home, a home he had designed, a home they were in danger of losing, and found her in the kitchen, humming as she arranged flowers in a vase. He took a deep breath, schooling his features into a mask of weary devastation. "Clara, we need to talk." Her humming stopped. She turned, a smile on her face that faltered as she saw his expression. "Ethan, what is it? You look like you've seen a ghost." He sank into a chair at the kitchen island, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of practiced despair. "It's the waterfront project, the soil analysis. It was falsified by the subcontractor. There's a foundational flaw. The client is suing. The insurance won't cover gross negligence, which is what they're calling it. Each lie was a small, sharp stone in his throat. We're in trouble, honey. Real trouble. I've had to liquidate most of the firm's assets to cover the initial legal fees. We might lose everything. He watched her face, searching for the woman he had married. He saw a flicker of genuine concern, her hand flying to her mouth. Oh, Ethan, no. But it was fleeting. The initial shock was quickly overshadowed by a different, more chilling emotion. Fear. Not for him, not for them. It was a social fear, cold and sharp. Her eyes darted around their perfect kitchen, at the sub-zero fridge, the Italian marble countertops. Her first words were not, "How can I help?" or "We'll get through this together." Her first words, spoken in a horrified whisper, were, "What are we going to tell my father?" In that moment, Ethan felt the first hairline crack form in the edifice of his heart. He knew with a dreadful certainty that the test was necessary. And he knew as he reached across the island to take her cold, trembling hand that he might not like the results. The destruction had already begun, not with a financial collapse, but with a single, devastating question. The following Sunday, they drove to her parents' estate for the weekly family dinner. The drive, usually filled with easy conversation, was cloaked in a tense, suffocating silence. Ethan could feel Clara's anxiety radiating from her like heat. She had spent the last 5 days in a state of low-grade panic, making frantic calls to her mother and her brother, Julian. Ethan had given her a carefully curated, plausible story, one that painted him as a victim of a contractor's fraud, but also as someone who had perhaps been too ambitious, too trusting. It was the perfect bait for the Thorne family's particular brand of condescension. As he pulled his Audi, a car he knew they'd be mentally repossessing, up the long gravel driveway to the Thorne mansion, Clara finally spoke. "Please, Ethan, just let me handle the talking with Daddy. He can be helpful if you approach him in the right way." "The right way?" Ethan asked, his voice carefully neutral. "You mean if I'm sufficiently deferential?" "No," she snapped, then softened her tone. "I just mean he doesn't respond well to pride. He respects humility." Ethan parked the car and turned to look at her. He respects weakness, Ethan thought, the corrections sharp and clear in his mind. It's the only thing that makes him feel strong. He said nothing, simply nodding as he got out of the car. The battle had begun before they even crossed the threshold. The house smelled of lemon polish and old money. Marcus, Eleanor, and Julian were waiting in the grand, two-story drawing room, arranged like a tribunal. Marcus stood by the massive stone fireplace, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. Julian, a younger, softer version of his father, was slouched in a wingback chair, scrolling through his phone with an air of profound boredom. Eleanor, skeletal and elegant in beige cashmere, glided forward to kiss Clara's cheek, her eyes flicking over Ethan with a look of distaste, as if he were something she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "Clara, darling," she murmured, her voice thin as parchment. "We were so worried when we heard your news." The word news was delivered with the same inflection one might use for contagious disease. Marcus dispensed with the pleasantries. He gestured for Ethan to sit, though not in the chair opposite him, but on a smaller, less comfortable ottoman slightly to the side. It was a deliberate power play, positioning Ethan as a supplicant. "Clara tells me you've run into some trouble, Ethan. A bit of a mess with that big project downtown." Ethan met his gaze, refusing to be cowed. "We were the victims of significant fraud, Marcus. It's a complex legal situation." "Fraud, ambition, call it what you will." Marcus waved a dismissive hand. "The point is, the ship is sinking. The question is, what to do about it? For Clara's sake, of course." He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes cold and assessing over the rim of the glass. "I've had a word with my head of facilities. We could probably find a place for you. Project management, overseeing the janitorial contracts for our office buildings. It's steady work. No glamour, but it pays the bills. A man has to provide for his family after all, even if it means swallowing his pride. The offer hung in the air, a perfectly crafted insult disguised as charity. It was a demotion, a humiliation designed to strip him of his professional identity. Ethan could feel the blood pounding in his ears. He looked to Clara, hoping for a flicker of outrage, a word of defense. He saw nothing. She sat rigidly on the sofa, her hands clenched in her lap, her expression pleading with him to just accept it, to make the problem go away. Her silence was his answer. She was not his partner in this room. She was her father's daughter. Julian finally looked up from his phone, a lazy, cruel smile playing on his lips. Yeah, Ethan, you'd get a cool little uniform and everything, maybe a big ring of keys. It'd be a step up from a bankruptcy court, right? Ethan felt a cold, calm clarity settle over him. The anger was there, a white-hot coal in his chest, but it was contained. He would not give them the satisfaction of an outburst. He turned his gaze back to Marcus, his voice even and measured. That's a very generous offer, Marcus, but I'm not quite ready to hang up my drafting pencils just yet. I'll manage. Manage? Marcus scoffed, a short, barking laugh. Don't be a fool. You're finished. The only person you're deceiving is yourself. He looked at his daughter. Clara, darling, you need to be realistic. Your husband's little dream is dead. Ethan stood up. The room fell silent. He looked down at the three of them. Marcus, the arrogant patriarch, Julian, the snide inheritor, Eleanor, the silent enforcer of status. Then he looked at his wife, who was now staring at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and, to his profound disappointment, embarrassment. Thank you for the dinner invitation, Ethan said, his voice devoid of all emotion. But I think we should be going. He didn't wait for Clara. He turned and walked out of the room, the sound of his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. He didn't know if she would follow. For a terrifying moment, he thought she might stay. But then he heard her hurried, apologetic murmurs to her family and the soft patter of her shoes as she rushed to catch up. The first humiliation was complete. In the car, she was crying, but not for him. How could you embarrass me like that? She sobbed. He was trying to help. Ethan just drove, the crack in his heart widening into a chasm. He was beginning to understand that the architecture of their marriage was more fragile than any building he had ever designed. And he was the only one who knew about the fatal, foundational flaw. The week that followed was a masterclass in passive aggression. The thorn's influence, Ethan discovered, was a subtle poison that seeped into every corner of their lives. A dinner reservation at a restaurant they'd frequented for years was suddenly lost. An invitation to a charity gala they were meant to attend was regrettably withdrawn due to a seating miscalculation. Friends of the family, people who had once clapped Ethan on the back and praised his genius, now looked through him at the country club, their eyes sliding away as if he were an unpleasant stain on the scenery. Clara felt every slight like a physical blow. Her identity was inextricably linked to her social standing, a standing that was now, in her eyes, in freefall. She spent her days on the phone, a constant low murmur of damage control and reassurance directed at her mother. No, mother, we're fine. Yes, it's just temporary. Ethan has a plan. The lies were thin and unconvincing, even to her. The second major humiliation occurred the following Saturday. Marcus had insisted they attend the club's annual summer reception. You can't just hide, he'd told Clara over the phone, his voice carrying clearly to where Ethan was sitting in the living room. You have to face the music. Show people we're taking care of you, even if he can't. So they went. Ethan wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, a quiet act of defiance against the narrative of his destitution. Clara wore a dress that was beautiful but muted, as if she were already in mourning for her social life. The moment they stepped onto the wide, manicured lawn overlooking the golf course, The temperature seemed to drop. Conversations faltered as they approached. Groups of people turned their backs, a subtle, coordinated shunning that was as effective as a locked door. Marcus held court near the open bar, a smug potentate surrounded by his sycophantic followers. As Ethan and Clara approached, he made a show of greeting them, placing a proprietary hand on Clara's arm while barely acknowledging Ethan. "Ah, here they are. Don't worry, everyone. The family is rallying. We look after our own." Then, turning to a group of his business associates, men who had once courted Ethan for design consultations, Marcus launched into a loud, thinly veiled monologue. "You know," he began, swirling the ice in his glass, "the key to lasting success is prudence, sound investments, real estate, tangible assets, not these artistic ventures. They're like fireworks, a bright flash, a loud bang, and then just smoke and falling debris. A lesson some people have to learn the hard way." Every eye in the vicinity flickered toward Ethan. It was a public dressing down, a deliberate act of emasculation. He stood there, a glass of sparkling water in his hand, his expression unreadable. He could feel Clara vibrating with shame beside him. She was shrinking, physically trying to make herself smaller. He wanted to take her hand, to present a united front, but he knew she would pull away. In this arena, he was a liability. Later, hiding in a secluded corner of the veranda, he overheard her. She was on the phone with Eleanor, her voice a choked, desperate whisper. "I can't take this, Mother. Everyone is staring. Marcus is making it worse. He's enjoying it. It's so humiliating. I don't know what to do. The shame of it all. I feel like I'm drowning." Shame. Not concern for their shared future. Not anger at her father's cruelty. Shame. The word echoed in the empty spaces of his heart. He slipped away before she could see him, the taste of betrayal bitter in his mouth. While Clara was navigating her social purgatory, Ethan was living a double life. By day, he played the part of the ruined architect, taking long, aimless walks and fielding her anxious questions with vague, weary answers. But in the afternoons, he would drive to a small, nondescript office he'd leased under a holding company's name. This was his new headquarters, the command center for his future. Here, there was no failure. Here, there was only strategy. He met with a team of the country's top financial advisors, lawyers, and wealth managers. The proceeds from the sale of Folktales designs were not just sitting in a bank account. They were being meticulously deployed. He was acquiring commercial properties, investing in tech startups, and most importantly, structuring the Folktales Foundation, a nonprofit he was creating to provide scholarships and mentorship to promising young architects from disadvantaged backgrounds. His former partner, Sarah Vance, the COO of Folktales Designs, and the only other person who knew the truth, was his co-conspirator. A sharp, no-nonsense woman with a mind like a steel trap, she had been appalled but not surprised by his plan. "The Thorns are emotional vampires, Ethan," she'd said, signing off on a transfer document. "It's about time someone held up a mirror. Just be careful you don't get bitten." During one of their meetings, Ethan found himself staring out the window at the city skyline, a tapestry of buildings he knew intimately. He had helped shape that view. He wasn't a failure. He was the silent, invisible architect of his own life, and now of his own vindication. He would sit in that quiet office, the hum of the city a distant soundtrack, and meticulously plan his next moves. He gathered documents, prepared statements, and choreographed the final reveal with the precision of a man designing a skyscraper. Every insult from Marcus, every pained look from Clara, was fuel. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It had evolved. It was about truth. It was about excavating his marriage from the rubble of pretense and seeing if anything of value remained. He touched the cool leather of the portfolio where he kept the key documents, the sale agreement, the foundation charter, the statements for the new accounts. This portfolio was becoming a symbolic object, a tangible representation of the vast, secret reality that existed just beneath the surface of the lie. He was building a new world while the thorns were gloating over the ruins of his old one. The irony was a quiet, constant companion. And as the days passed, as Clara's desperation grew, he knew the time for the final, devastating revelation was drawing near. He had to let the crisis reach its peak. He had to see just how far she would go to save herself from the shame he had manufactured. He would soon find out. The third week of the charade brought with it a new level of desperation from Clara. The social shunning had solidified, and her parents' help had become more suffocating. Marcus had taken to calling Ethan's cell phone directly, leaving voicemails that were a toxic cocktail of pity and command. "Ethan, it's Marcus. I haven't heard back about the facilities position. The offer won't stand forever. Don't let your pride get in the way of feeding your wife." Clara, meanwhile, had started talking about solutions. Her solutions. They were born of panic and a deep-seated need to restore her family's equilibrium. She suggested he sell his collection of vintage watches, a passion of his that she had always supported. She suggested they sell her grandmother's jewelry, heirlooms she had sworn she would never part with. Each suggestion was a small surrender, a chipping away at the life they had built, all in service of placating her family. Ethan would listen patiently, his heart aching. "We don't need to do that, Clara. We just need to be patient and let the legal process play out," he'd say, testing her, hoping she'd finally say, "We are what's important, not the things we own." But she never did. The true betrayal, the one that would become the centerpiece of his quiet grief, happened on a Thursday afternoon. Ethan had returned home early from his secret office. As he walked down the hall, he heard Clara's voice coming from the study. She was on the phone, speaking in a hushed, conspiratorial tone. "No, Julian, he doesn't know. He's so wrapped up in his own misery, he's not paying attention to the accounts," she was saying. A cold dread washed over Ethan. He stopped, pressing himself against the wall just out of sight. "It's our joint savings, the one we started when we first got married. There's about 100,000 in there. If I move it now, you can get in on that deal. And once it pays out in a few weeks, we can put it back. More than put it back. We'll have a profit. We can show Daddy that we solved the problem ourselves." Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. Their joint savings. It wasn't their main account, which he had quietly fortified weeks ago. This was the sentimental account. It was the money they had painstakingly saved in the first 5 years of their marriage, $1 at a time. It was their dream house down payment fund, then their first big vacation fund. It held more than money, it held memories. It was a symbol of their partnership, of their shared journey from nothing to something. And she was about to give it to her feckless brother for some vague, get-rich-quick scheme. "Are you sure it's a sure thing?" Clara asked, a note of doubt in her voice. Julian's voice was a tinny, confident buzz on the other end. Ethan could imagine his smug expression. "Clara, it's a can't miss. A Brazilian land development deal. My friend's uncle is in on it. It's a pre-development price. We'll triple our money in a month, guaranteed. You have to move fast, though. The window closes tomorrow." Ethan's blood ran cold. A Brazilian land deal. It was one of the oldest scams in the book. His brother-in-law, in his arrogance and greed, was walking them both off a cliff. And his wife, his partner, was handing him the rope. "Okay," Clara whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and excitement. "Okay, I'll do it. I'll do it tonight. Just don't tell anyone until it pays out. This will be our secret." Ethan backed away from the door, his movements silent and robotic. He walked into the living room and sank onto the sofa, the beautiful, sunlit room suddenly feeling like a tomb. This was it. This was the bottom. She wasn't just failing to support him. She wasn't just enabling her family's cruelty. She was actively betraying him. She was taking the one thing that was sacredly theirs, the foundation of their financial life together, and sacrificing it on the altar of her family's approval. The pain was sharp and visceral, a physical blow to his chest. It wasn't about the money. He could lose $100,000 without even noticing. It was the act itself. It was the secrecy. It was the complete and utter violation of their trust. The woman he loved had looked at their shared past, their symbolic first steps, and saw it only as a resource to solve a problem that didn't even exist. A problem he had created to test the very loyalty she was now so spectacularly failing. He sat there for an hour, motionless, as the afternoon sun slanted across the floor. The test was over. The results were in, and they were devastating. He had set out to find a crack in the foundation and had discovered the entire structure was rotten to the core. When Clara came out of the study, her face was flushed. She saw him on the sofa and startled. "Ethan, you're home early." "Just got here," he lied, his voice a dead calm. "Is everything okay?" she asked, unable to meet his eyes. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time he felt a vast, empty distance between them. He was looking at a stranger. "No, Clara," he said softly, the words landing with quiet finality in the space between them. "Nothing is okay." That night he didn't sleep. He lay beside her, feeling the warmth of her body, and felt utterly alone. He knew what he had to do. There would be no more tests, no more quiet observation. The time for strategy was over. The time for truth had come. He would arrange one final dinner, one last gathering of the Thorne family. But this time he would not be the one on trial. He would be the judge, the jury, and the executioner of their illusions. The destruction she had wrought upon his heart would be mirrored by the destruction he would now bring to her world. He made the call the next morning. "Marcus," he said, his voice polite but firm, "Clara and I would like to have you, Eleanor, and Julian over for dinner on Saturday. There are some things we need to discuss in person." There was a surprised pause on the other end of the line, followed by Marcus's booming, patronizing tone. "Of course, Ethan. Of course. Coming to your senses, are you? Ready to accept my help?" "Something like that," Ethan replied, a cold smile touching his lips for the first time in weeks. "Let's just say it's time to settle all family accounts, once and for all." The air in the Thorne Mansion's dining room was colder than usual, a palpable chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was the final dinner, the culmination of a month of corrosive lies and painful truths. Ethan had insisted the meal be at Marcus's home, a strategic choice to confront them in the seat of their power. He wanted to dismantle their world on their own turf. Clara had been a nervous wreck all day. She knew this dinner was a turning point. She likely assumed Ethan was finally going to capitulate, to beg for her father's help, and her anxiety was a frantic mix of relief and shame. She had no idea she was walking into an ambush. Earlier that day, Ethan had checked their joint savings account online. As expected, the balance was a mere $237.14. A screenshot was saved to his phone. The betrayal was now documented, a cold, hard fact. They sat down at the same polished mahogany table where he had endured his first humiliation. The seating arrangement was the same, with Ethan once again relegated to a position of lesser importance. Marcus, Eleanor, and Julian exchanged small, knowing smiles, the smug satisfaction of predators who believe their prey has finally surrendered. Marcus began after the appetizer plates were cleared. He dispensed with any pretense of subtlety. He was here for the kill. "So, Ethan," he said, dabbing his lips with a linen napkin, "Clara mentioned you wanted to discuss things. I assume this means you've come to your senses. You're ready to stop this foolish pride and accept my offer. It's for the best, for Clara." He reached over and patted his daughter's hand, a gesture of ownership. Ethan remained silent, letting him talk. He looked at Clara. Her eyes were downcast, her face pale. She was a portrait of misery, trapped between the man she had married and the family she could not defy. Frankly, it's about time, Marcus continued, his voice rising in volume and arrogance. This past month has been an embarrassment. For you, of course, but more importantly, for my daughter. I did not raise her to live in a state of constant anxiety, worrying about bills, her social standing in tatters. You made promises to her, Ethan. You promised her a certain life, and you have failed, spectacularly, to deliver. Julian chimed in, leaning forward with a sneer. He's right, you know. It's not just about the money, it's about competence. You flew too close to the sun, mate. Now your wings are melted. Ethan picked up his water glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and placed it back on the coaster with a soft click. He held his portfolio on his lap, his fingers resting lightly on the leather. The quiet before the storm. He let the silence stretch, forcing them to lean in, to wait for his response. You've made a lot of assumptions, Marcus, Ethan said finally, his voice calm and low, yet it cut through the room's tension like a knife. About my business, about my competence, about my marriage. Marcus scoffed. They aren't assumptions, they're observations, facts. The fact is, you're broke. The fact is, you're a failure. He leaned back, spreading his hands in a gesture of finality. And the fact is, you're no longer a suitable husband for my daughter. I've been talking to my lawyers. A quiet annulment, perhaps. Citing fraud. It would be fitting. You pretended to be something you're not. A man of substance. We can protect Clara. Ensure she's provided for. Away from this mess you've created. This was it. The final, venomous strike. He wasn't just attacking Ethan's career. He was trying to dismantle his life, to erase his marriage. Ethan saw Clara flinch, a flicker of pain in her eyes. But still, she said nothing. Her silence was the final piece of evidence he needed. Ethan slowly turned his head to look at his wife. He held her gaze, and for the first time that night, she was forced to look at him. Her eyes were swimming with unshed tears. Clara, he asked, his voice gentle but laced with steel, is that what you want? She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She just stared at him, trapped. He held her gaze for a moment longer, then turned back to her father. The time for quiet observation was over. The time for truth had arrived. You're right about one thing, Marcus, Ethan said, the calm in his voice more menacing than any shout. There has been a fraud, a massive one, but I'm not the one who's been deceived. He let that statement hang in the air, a puzzle they couldn't yet solve. The smug looks began to falter, replaced by frowns of confusion. The storm was no longer gathering. The first drops of rain had begun to fall. Ethan's gaze swept across the three Thorne family members, lingering for a moment on each of them. Marcus, puffed up with self-importance. Eleanor, her face a mask of cold disdain. Julian, smirking, convinced of his own cleverness. Then his eyes settled back on Clara, whose confusion was now mixed with a dawning dread. She knew his tone. It was the voice he used when he had solved a complex design problem, the voice of absolute certainty. Let's correct a few of your facts, Marcus, Ethan began, his tone conversational, as if discussing the weather. First, my firm. You said it was sinking. A failure. He paused. In reality, Kalis Designs was acquired 4 weeks ago by the Omniar Group for a sum that has 9 figures, before the decimal point. The silence in the room was absolute, a sudden, shocking vacuum. Marcus's mouth, which had been opened to deliver another retort, hung slack. Eleanor's perfectly manicured hand froze on its way to her wineglass. Julian's smirk vanished, replaced by a blank, uncomprehending stare. 9 figures? Marcus stammered, the words catching in his throat. That's impossible. Omniarch? They're the biggest player in the world. They are, Ethan confirmed calmly, and they paid a premium for my portfolio and my team. The deal was finalized the day I came home and told Clara we were having financial difficulties. He turned his head slightly to look at his wife. Her face had gone ashen. The blood had drained from it, leaving her skin the color of wax. The tears that had been welling in her eyes now spilled over, silent tracks on a face frozen in shock. He didn't give them time to process. He moved to his next point, his voice relentless. Second, my competence. He looked directly at Julian. You mentioned something about my wings melting. He allowed himself a small, cold smile. Speaking of competence, Julian, how is your Brazilian land development deal coming along? Julian's face went from white to a blotchy, terrified red. How do you know about that? Because it's one of the oldest and most common scams targeting greedy, inexperienced investors, Ethan said, his voice sharp. There is no land, Julian. There is no deal. There is only a man in a boiler room in a country you've never been to, who is currently enjoying the $100,000 you convinced my wife to steal from our savings account. He delivered the last part of the sentence while looking directly at Clara. Our savings account, Clara. The one we started with our wedding money. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? A choked sob escaped Clara's lips. She covered her face with her hands, her body shaking. The truth was out, a harsh, ugly spotlight illuminating her betrayal for her entire family to see. Marcus swiveled his head, his face a mask of fury, no longer directed at Ethan, but at his own children. You did what? You took money from him? And you, he snarled at Julian, you lost it in some half-baked scheme? Are you an idiot? I thought it was real, Julian stammered, shrinking under his father's rage. Clara said we needed to fix things. Fix things? Ethan's voice cut through their burgeoning argument. He slowly, deliberately, placed the black leather portfolio on the table. The sound it made was a soft, definitive thud. There was nothing to fix. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The power was in the implication. For a month, he said, his voice now filled with a quiet, profound sadness that was more cutting than any anger. I have watched you, all of you. I gave you a story, a fiction, and you have shown me exactly who you are. He looked at Marcus. You, Marcus, are a bully. You don't respect humility. You prey on perceived weakness. Your concern wasn't for your daughter's well-being, but for the stain my failure would leave on your reputation. He turned to Eleanor. You are a snob, pure and simple. You measure a person's worth by their bank balance and their social connections. You looked at me with disgust, not because you thought I had failed my wife, but because you thought I had failed to live up to your shallow standards. His gaze fell on Julian. And you are a parasite, eager to gloat over my supposed downfall while simultaneously trying to profit from it. You used your own sister's panic to fund your greed. Finally, he looked at Clara, and his voice softened, but the pain within it was immense. And you, Clara, you broke my heart. It wasn't the thought of losing our home or our money that terrified you. It was the thought of losing your status. You chose their approval over our partnership. You chose to betray my trust, to steal from our shared past, rather than stand by my side. That is a fact none of my money can change. The room was a tableau of devastation. The Thorns, who had begun the meal with such smug certainty, were shattered. Their arrogance had been stripped away, leaving only the ugly, raw truth of their characters. The reversal of fortune was complete. The man they had mocked and dismissed now held all the power, and he had just used it to demolish the very foundations of their world. The quiet bombs had all detonated, and the fallout was just beginning. The heavy silence that followed Ethan's pronouncement was broken by a soft knock on the dining room door. The Thorns' butler, a man who had served the family for 30 years and had looked at Ethan with pity all evening, opened it. Standing in the doorway was Sarah Vance. She was dressed in a sharp, dark gray pantsuit, an iPad in her hand, her expression one of cool, professional neutrality. She looked like she belonged in a boardroom, not a dramatic family dinner, which was precisely the effect Ethan had intended. Sarah, Ethan said, his voice calm. Thank you for waiting. Please, come in. Sarah walked into the room, her heels clicking decisively on the hardwood floor. Her presence was an immediate and jarring shift in the dynamics. She was an outsider, an official presence, and her arrival signaled that this was no longer just a family argument. It was a formal proceeding. Marcus, Eleanor, Julian, Ethan said, gesturing to his former partner. This is Sarah Vance. She was the chief operating officer at my firm, and she is now overseeing the transitional period for the Omniarch Group. The name Omniarch, again. Marcus flinched as if he'd been struck. He knew who they were, and he knew what it meant that a representative of that global behemoth was standing in his dining room. His entire strategy of condescension was predicated on the belief that he was the most powerful person in any room he occupied. That belief had just been irrevocably shattered. Sarah's eyes swept over the scene with a quick, analytical glance. Mr. Thorne, she said, her voice crisp and devoid of emotion. She nodded almost imperceptibly at Marcus, then turned her attention to Julian. Mr. Thorne, Jr., I took the liberty of having our forensic accounting team trace the wire transfer from your sister's account. The receiving entity in Brazil is a shell corporation linked to a well-known international fraud ring. The FBI has an active file on them. I've prepared a summary for your lawyers, should you choose to pursue it, though recovery is unlikely. Julian looked like he was going to be sick. The abstract concept of being scammed had just become a terrifying reality involving the FBI. Sarah then turned to Marcus. And Mr. Thorne, Sr., the new CEO of Omniarch's North American Design Division, is a man named David Chen. I believe you sit on the museum board with him. Sarah smiled, a thin, sharp expression. He's very excited to hear about the family connection. He'll be calling you next week to discuss a potential collaboration. I'm sure you'll have plenty to talk about. It was a masterstroke. Ethan hadn't just revealed his success. He had woven it directly into Marcus's own social and professional world, making it impossible for him to ignore or dismiss. Marcus would now have to face a peer who knew the full, humiliating story of how he had treated his now phenomenally successful son-in-law. The public shaming he had inflicted on Ethan at the country club would be returned to him 100-fold. Marcus's face, which had been pale with shock, was now turning a deep, apoplectic red. He tried to pivot, to salvage the situation with a sudden, desperate pivot to sycophancy. Well, Ethan, my boy, he boomed, his voice unnaturally jovial. A test. I see it now. You were testing us. A brilliant move. Always knew you had it in you. A true captain of industry. Ethan held up a hand, and the word died in Marcus's throat. No, Marcus, it was not a test for you, he said, his voice cold as ice. Your character was never in question. I've known who you are for years. This was about my wife, about my marriage. He looked at Clara, whose face was still buried in her hands. Your approval was never something I valued, but her loyalty, her trust, that I valued more than anything. The finality in his voice was devastating. He was drawing a line not between rich and poor, but between his world and theirs. Sarah stepped forward, placing a slim folder on the table in front of Clara. Clara, she said, her voice softening slightly, Ethan has instructed his lawyers to draw up these documents. They are not divorce papers. Clara looked up, her eyes red and swollen. They establish a legal separation of all assets, Sarah continued gently. Everything Ethan has earned, and everything he will earn from this point forward, will be held in his name alone, protected in a series of trusts. The house is in one of those trusts. You are welcome to continue living there, and a generous spousal support account has been established for your personal expenses. But your access to the principal fortune is, as of now, terminated. It was a clean, surgical cut. He wasn't throwing her out. He wasn't leaving her destitute. He was simply removing her from the equation of his success, the very success she had been so desperate for him to represent. He was giving her the lifestyle she craved, but severing her connection to its source. Ethan stood up. "You have a choice, Clara," he said, his voice quiet but resonant in the shattered room. "You can stay here, in this house, in this world of appearances and judgment that you value so much. Or you can start the long, difficult journey of earning back my trust. It begins with you walking out of this room with me, right now, and leaving all of this behind. But it doesn't end there. It means finding out who you are without their approval. It means building a character, not just maintaining a reputation. The choice is yours." He looked at her, his heart a painful knot in his chest. He had brought them to this point, had burned down the world of lies. Now, in the smoldering ruins, he had to see if the woman he loved would have the courage to walk out of the fire with him, or if she would choose to remain in the gilded cage she had fought so hard to protect. He turned, and without looking back, walked toward the door, leaving the choice and the future of their marriage hanging in the suffocating silence. The months that followed the dinner were a slow, painful unfolding of consequences. Ethan did not look back as he walked out of the Thorne mansion that night. He got in his car and drove, half expecting, half hoping to see Clara run out after him. She didn't. The weight of her family, of the life she knew, was too strong an anchor. Her choice, for the moment, was made in her inaction. The fallout for the Thornes was swift and brutal, a perfect example of poetic justice. Julian was financially ruined. The $100,000 loss was a debt he now owed Ethan, a fact Ethan did not let him forget. Marcus, in a rare act of tough love fueled by his own fury and humiliation, refused to bail him out. Julian was forced to sell his sports car and his ridiculously overpriced apartment, moving into a small rental and taking the very same project management job overseeing janitorial contracts that Marcus had so cruelly offered Ethan. Every day was a reminder of his arrogance and folly. Marcus and Eleanor faced a different kind of ruin, a social one. The story of Ethan's secret success and their appalling treatment of him spread like wildfire through their elite circles, no doubt helped along by a few discreet words from David Chen, the Omniarch CEO. The Thornes were no longer seen as powerful patriarchs, but as fools who had spectacularly misjudged the situation. They became figures of ridicule. Invitations dried up. Friends became distant. Their power, which was built on the perception of their influence and good judgment, evaporated overnight. They were forced to look into the moral mirror Ethan had held up to them, and the reflection was ugly and undeniable. Ethan, for his part, retreated from the drama. He moved out of the house he had shared with Clara, leaving her there as promised, and took a Spartan but elegant penthouse apartment overlooking the city. He threw himself into his work, not the acquisition of more wealth, but the building of his foundation. He spent his days interviewing promising young students, reviewing their portfolios, and setting up mentorship programs. He found a quiet, profound satisfaction in using his fortune to build futures rather than to simply accumulate possessions. His new life was one of purpose, a stark contrast to the hollow world of status he had so narrowly escaped. 2 weeks after the dinner, Clara called him. Her voice was small, fragile. "Can we talk?" she asked. They met at a neutral location, a quiet cafe halfway between his new apartment and her old life. She looked diminished. The designer clothes hung on her as if on a stranger. The confidence that had been her birthright was gone, replaced by a deep, hollow-eyed uncertainty. She had, she told him, cut off contact with her family. She had told Marcus she would not speak to him again until he called Ethan and offered a genuine, unconditional apology, something she knew her prideful father might never do. She had started seeing a therapist to unravel the decades of conditioning that had led her to prioritize her family's approval over her own integrity. "I was wrong, Ethan," she said, tears streaming down her face. a different kind of tears than the ones he had seen before. These were not tears of shame or self-pity, but of genuine remorse. I was so wrong. I was a coward. I looked at you and I didn't see my husband who was hurting. I saw a threat to my comfort, to my status. I betrayed you, and I betrayed us, and I am so sorry. Ethan listened, his expression unreadable. The apology was necessary, but it wasn't a magic wand. The wound she had inflicted was deep. I appreciate you saying that, Clara, he said, his voice gentle but firm. But an apology doesn't erase what happened. You didn't just fail a test. You revealed who you were in that moment, and I can't unsee that. He explained that he wasn't going to file for divorce, not yet, but he couldn't go back to the way things were. The woman I want to be married to is a partner, he said, an equal, someone who would defend me even if I was truly a failure, someone whose love isn't conditional on success. I don't know if you can be that person. I don't even know if you know how to be that person. He told her she needed to find out. He would continue to support her financially, but she needed to build a life for herself, by herself. She needed to find a purpose, a passion, something that defined her outside of being a thorn or his wife. If we are ever to have a future, he concluded, it has to be between two whole people, not one person and someone else's shadow. You need to stop being a shadow, Clara. It was a painful, difficult conversation, but it was honest. The resolution would not be swift or easy. There would be no dramatic reunion in the rain. The destruction of their old marriage had been total. If they were to have a new one, it would have to be built from the ground up, brick by painful brick, on a new foundation of honesty and earned trust. As he left the cafe, he felt a profound sense of sadness, but also a sliver of hope. The storm had passed, and in the quiet aftermath there was, for the first time, a chance for genuine growth. A year later. The city skyline from Ethan's office window is a familiar comfort. He stands not in a vast, opulent CEO's suite, but in the open-plan, light-filled workspace of the Kalis Foundation. The walls are covered not with awards, but with the sketches and models of the first class of scholarship recipients. His life has become quieter, richer, more meaningful. He has poured his energy, wealth, and experience into creating opportunities, building ladders for those who started with nothing, just as he once had. His relationship with Clara has evolved into something new and tentative. She did the work. After their conversation in the cafe, she moved out of their cavernous house and into a small, simple apartment that she paid for herself with a job she found at an art gallery. It was a humbling step down in lifestyle, but a massive step up in character. She continued with therapy, confronting the deep-seated insecurities that had driven her actions. She began volunteering, rediscovering a passion for art history she had abandoned years ago. She was, for the first time in her life, becoming her own person. They talk, they have dinner once a week. The conversations are different now. They talk about her work, about the students he's mentoring, about books and ideas. They are getting to know each other again, not as the rising architect and the socialite wife, but as two people who have been through a fire and are examining their scars. The trust is not fully restored. Some things, once broken, can never be perfectly mended, but a new kind of respect has begun to form. He sees in her a strength and resilience he never knew she possessed. She sees in him a grace and integrity that she now understands is more valuable than any fortune. One evening they are walking through a park after dinner. The autumn air is crisp. "My father called me," she says quietly, breaking a comfortable silence. "He and my mother have sold the house. They're moving to a smaller place a few hours away. He said he was sorry." He actually used the word. Ethan nods, processing this. "And how did that feel?" Clara looks at her hands. "Honestly, it felt distant, like hearing news about a stranger. His approval, his apology, it doesn't hold the power over me that it used to. I'm sad for him, for the person he is, but my happiness doesn't depend on him anymore. She looks up at Ethan, her eyes clear and direct. It doesn't depend on you either. I'm building it myself. Ethan stops walking and turns to face her. In her eyes, he finally sees the woman he had hoped to find all along. Strong, independent, whole. He reaches out and takes her hand. It feels different now. Not the cold, trembling hand of a frightened socialite, but the warm, steady hand of a partner. I know you are, he says, a genuine smile reaching his eyes. And it's the most impressive thing I've ever seen. The destruction he had felt that day she emptied their account was real. It had torn him apart. But sometimes, things need to be torn down to their foundations before they can be rebuilt properly. He had set out to test the structure of his marriage and found it wanting. But in the wreckage, they had both found something more valuable: themselves. Their future is still unwritten, but for the first time, they hold the pen together, ready to design a new life. One based not on appearances or wealth, but on the solid, unshakable bedrock of respect and integrity. So, that's the story. It's a powerful reminder that a person's true character isn't revealed when things are going well, but when they face what they believe to be a crisis. The real wealth in our lives isn't what's in our bank accounts, but the trust, loyalty, and integrity we share with the people we love. What do you think? Could you forgive a betrayal like Clara's, even if she did the work to change? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Your perspective is what makes this community so special. And as always, if this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more stories about the complexities of life and relationships. Thank you for being here. We'll talk again soon.